My mother avoided my home until my lawyer exposed who poisoned us today. The sentence landed in Alexandre's head like a shard of glass he could not pull out, not because someone had said it aloud yet, but because the life he had been living, one hand on his phone, the other on the steering wheel, always 2 meetings ahead, had begun to show cracks that morning, like hairline fractures running unseen until the light hit them just so. Morning light fell thin across the kitchen tiles. It cut along the edge of the table and stopped at a teacup where steam rose as if from a small private altar. Antônia sat straight-backed in the chair she had occupied for as long as anyone could remember, her cardigan buttoned though the room was warm. Her knuckles tapped the wood in that rhythm she used to steady herself before prayer. 3 soft knocks, 1 pause, 3 soft knocks again. A dozen years had taught her to make small rituals mean something solid. Mariana came in with a tray like sunshine in a tailored dress, an espresso, a folded napkin, the sort of smile that economized warmth. She moved through the kitchen with the smooth precision of someone who polished appearances before anyone else saw them. In the doorway she found Antônia, looking smaller than the sofa, and paused as if the sight had interrupted a carefully rehearsed plan. "Good morning, Mom," Mariana said. The tone was light, the smile bright enough to be photographed. "I brought breakfast downstairs so you wouldn't have to climb the stairs. I know you don't like them." Antônia forced the smile that had become polite practice and nodded. "Thank you," she said. Her voice had the paper-thin quality of things folded into drawers. Rosangela stood behind the stove, dabbing at a pan but listening by habit, her whole body tuned to shifts in the air. The tray thudded down a little harder than necessary. A small sound swallowed into the clink of porcelain. Mariana rested a hand on Antonia's arm over-earnestly, the kind of touch that conveys ownership disguised as care. Their eyes met for a second, and in that second Antônia felt the sting she had learned to call the wrongness, 1,000 little wrongs stitched into domestic life. She folded her napkin tighter. Later, when the front door shut behind Alexandre as he left for the office, late of course, with a call already in his pocket, he would not see the bruise near his mother's hip, hidden by the cardigan. He would not read the notes Rosangela had begun to keep in her mind, the oddness of a misplaced pill bottle, the way Antônia lingered longer at the sink as if trying to hold herself up, the vague illnesses that came after certain meals. Mariana's mask served her well in public. At the charity luncheon she hosted, she placed Antônia on the second-best armchair and introduced her as "my mother-in-law who we adore." Her laughter at the right moments, her polished gestures, the careful lines of her social media captions, all of it kept the house safe from scrutiny. She greeted family and neighbors with precise warmth. She polished the world until all the rough edges were gone. Behind closed doors, a different choreography played out. There were suggestions. Why not wear something more flattering? Why not lose a little weight? Small, relentless shifts meant to make Antônia feel inadequate and then unsafe. There were instructions, thinly veiled as concern, that rearranged the apartment so Antônia had to climb stairs more often. There were the afternoons Antônia refused to make known, when wine glasses were refilled and a plate meant for her portion ended up elsewhere. Rosangela saw the pattern first because she had no way of not seeing it. She cleaned the house, prepared the meals, listened when Antonia's sentences trailed off. She was careful in her attention. She had watched enough lives to know the cadence of secrets. One Wednesday, putting away laundry folded with the same care as always, her sleeve brushed against fabric that clung to warmth. She paused, and when she lifted the cardigan, she noticed the bruise. It was not small. The skin held a dull purple that spoke of pressure, perhaps a fall, perhaps a hand. She didn't speak of it at the moment. She slid the cardigan back into place and sat at the edge of the bed for a long minute. Her hands had known hard work and silence. They had put up with indignities and kept them from becoming scandal. But silence had limits, and Rosangela felt them like the creak in a beam about to give way. The abuse had not begun with striking. It grew in whispers, in omissions, in the careful rearrangement of the facts of Antonia's days until she felt bewildered and small. The phone calls Alexandre missed were excuses. The family dinners where everything seemed fine were rehearsals in which Mariana was both director and critic. Each humiliation was handed over with a smile and a justification. Antônia learned to apologize first, for asking for help, for being ill, for having needs. The first visible wound, the kind that could not be folded into politeness, shifted things. At the clinic, Dr. Renato, a man whose hands were steady and whose voice carried the kind of authority that practiced calm, lifted the cardigan and frowned. "This looks inconsistent with a simple trip," he said, more to himself than to Antônia. He did not offer theories. His eyes were the careful space between hypothesis and certainty. "Are you sure? Are there any other times this happened?" Antonia's eyes went to the floor, to the threadbare rug by the sink. She had rehearsed small lies into protective strategies, ways of saying nothing to shield the son she loved from conflict. She had not told Alexandre. She could not imagine speaking them aloud in front of him and letting him see that his home was not the safe place he had thought it was.
"It's nothing," she said. The words were a soft lock slid into the wrong door. Dr. Renato made notes anyway. He asked gentle questions and recorded the answers in a ledger as if tallying a truth slowly coming into focus. He asked about medications, about mobility, about whether any falls had been observed. The chart began to fill with small inconsistencies, reports of drowsiness that came after meals, faint episodes that left Antônia shaky, a lethargy that did not fit the pattern of normal aging. "Let's run blood work," he said, "just to be thorough. Sometimes metabolism changes or medications interact. And photos of the bruises. If you'll let me, I'll document everything." Rosangela sat in the corner of the examination room like someone waiting to be given orders. She had her phone out under the table and took a photo of the bruise anyway. It was a fast, furtive thing, a record for the day when there would be no question. She thumbed the screen and stored the image in a folder labeled with Antonia's name. She wrote small notes into the memo app, dates, times, what Antônia had eaten, which medications she had taken, whether anyone had been in the apartment that day. The inventory of what had not been said began to look less like private shame and more like a pattern. At twilight that week, a minor argument fluttered into something sharper. Alexandre arrived home earlier than usual, his face tighter than the evenings he hurried out of the house. He had noticed something in the way his mother moved, smaller steps, eyes that lingered on the stove, an apology in each sentence like a small coin offered to hush guilt. That night, after dinner, he noticed the cardigan shifted and the hint of a bruise. He asked innocently, the way someone tests a crack before it opens. "What happened?" he asked, concerned. Antônia smiled the automatic smile and said, as she always had, "Just clumsy." Mariana's knife paused on the cutting board, and she turned. "Clumsy? She trips on her rug sometimes," she said, quick and annoyed. "I told her we should replace it." "No," Alexandre said. The word carried only a little breath, but it was enough. "Are you okay, Mom?" Antonia's hands went to his as if to steady him instead. "I'm fine, Alex, really, it's nothing to worry about." The kitchen pulsed with a quiet electrical tension. Words hung like laundry in the air, waiting for a breeze. Alexandre had lived in the safe middle, a son who assumed his parents' reality was straightforward. He worked in a law firm that rewarded certainty and punished sloppiness. His calendar had few blank spaces. He had built a life that made little room for the idea that the person who took his mother's calls could be orchestrating harm. Over the next days, the small signs multiplied. Pills missing from their containers, one bottle with the label pasted crookedly, a cup of tea left half-finished with a faint metallic taste. Antonia's appetite thinned. She nodded off on the sofa after watching the television for an hour. Once she dropped a spoon and blamed the clatter on her hands, But Rosangela noticed the hesitation, the way Antonia's hand shook a fraction more than it should have. At night, Rosangela wrote more in her little app, careful, factual entries. She began to timestamp. 7:14, 9:32 a.m. Tea served with bowl of biscuits. Mother complained of dizziness at 11:15 a.m., slept until 2 p.m. 7:16, pill bottle missing from kitchen cabinet, found under sink in trash, empty. 7:18, neighbor saw Mariana remove Antonia's handbag at dinner. Evidence is often born as a habit. Photographs, timestamps, receipts, small records amassed by someone insisting that a life should be accounted for. When Alexandre finally sat down in the living room on a Sunday afternoon, he found the folder on the coffee table. Rosangela had placed it there, hand hovering, as if to test the temperature of the paper. It contained the photographs she had taken, the notes with times and dates, a small plastic bag with a bent pill, and a scrap of a receipt she swore she had found folded into a cookery magazine. "What's this?" he asked. Rosangela looked at him as one looks at a man who has only just stood on a new cliff. "I kept it. I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe you should see." He flipped through the photographs. The images read like a quiet accusation. Close-ups of the bruise at different stages, a snapshot of a teacup with a smudge of something that had not been there before, a photo of a medication box with the seal sliced open. The receipt was from a small online store selling health supplements. It showed a purchase made in Mariana's name, delivered to their address weeks earlier. The time on Rosangela's notes matched the days Antônia had felt faint. Alexandre's chest tightened. He had been absent. He had let the world's priorities set the plan for his days. Now the folder was an altar of small betrayals. He felt a primitive outrage for his mother, for the thinness of safety he had assumed would always exist. He wanted to blame himself, and then to fix the world with the sort of certainty that only weeks of legal briefs had taught him to wield. He called his office and canceled his next meeting. He set his laptop aside and let the quiet pull him in. He read through Rosangela's notes again, slower. He noticed a pattern in the timing of Antonia's faintness, always shortly after meals, sometimes after a particular cup of tea. He remembered, with a late and terrible clarity, the mornings his mother refused certain requests. He sat with the evidence as if with a hot coal. "You should come with me to the clinic," Dr. Renato said, when Alexandre returned with the folder and watched the doctor's face as he examined Antônia. "We can run more than photographs. Blood work, urine, a toxicology screen if we have reason to suspect an external factor." "We do," Alexandre said. The word felt like a small vessel, ready to be filled. He had no evidence yet of anything precise, and that was the problem. Suspicion without documentation can split a household. He had to move carefully, not to make accusations that would scar his mother further, not to fling blame at a woman who knew how to craft public sympathy. "Document everything," the doctor advised, professional and clipped. "Chain of custody for any samples. If we find anything abnormal, we'll need clear records. Also photographs now. And written testimony from anyone who has observed the accidents or the symptoms. If there is a pattern, it will show." Mariana was there when Alexandre left with Antônia after the tests. She kissed his cheek in a way that read to her as gracious, to him as possessive. She said softly, "Everything will be fine, Alex. Don't make a fuss." Her voice had an edge like a polished blade. Her public composition had always been part of the problem. She was the kind of person who could stand in a lobby and be luminous, and then close a door and be something else entirely. Alexandre had always wanted to believe in people the way his mother did, to give them the benefit of the doubt. Now, doubt felt like the better currency. At his firm, Alexandre found his desk smaller than he remembered. He called a friend at the firm in a quiet panic, not to ask for legal counsel yet, but for advice about where to begin. "Document everything," his colleague said, the phrase a legal refrain. "I don't want to destroy a family," Alexandre murmured. "Sometimes protecting someone is what makes family," the friend replied. "If you need help getting proper legal advice, I can refer you." The law works in systems, filings and notices, chains of custody and motions. A good lawyer does not promise miracles. They build paper bridges. When Alexandre finally sat across from the lawyer his colleague recommended, someone with a reputation for careful work and a steady voice, the man listened with a kind of gravity. "You don't have to make accusations to begin an inquiry," the lawyer said. He set his cup down and folded his hands. "We do what we always do, collect facts. We preserve evidence properly. If there is reason to suspect criminal action, we advise a measured approach that protects the victim immediately." "What do you need?" Alexandre asked. "Everything you have. Photos, notes, receipts. A list of medications and the times they were taken. Any witnesses who can testify to seeing the care routine or any inconsistencies. And most importantly, samples," the lawyer said. "Blood, urine, any remaining medication packaging. Chain of custody is crucial. If we're going to suggest toxicology as a possibility, we need secure evidence. A preliminary toxicology can flag substances that aren't expected. It doesn't always explain everything, but it's a start." Alexandre felt an odd relief. The lawyer did not leap to dramatic conclusions. He spoke of procedure, of measured steps. He did not promise immediate vindication. That steadiness in itself felt like a refuge. Rosangela started keeping 2 folders, one for the photographs, one for the small items she collected carefully in plastic bags. When Alexandre asked where she kept things, she tapped the second folder and said, "Locked in my closet. I didn't tell you because I swore I'd keep quiet. I was keeping your mother's dignity, but now I see that keeping silent was part of what hurt her." The items were small: a broken pill, a cup with a faint ring of residue, a receipt from a pharmacy whose delivery note showed a substitution of one bottle for another on the day Antônia reported dizziness. There was a sticky note, hastily scribbled in a hand that might have been Mariana's, reminding someone to switch the evening pills, with a downpour of errands signed and dated. Whether that note meant anything legally would depend on chain of custody and corroboration, but the pattern was beginning to stitch itself with quiet insistence. As Alexandre began to marshal the facts, he started noticing Mariana's micro-strategies. She called him at work more often than usual with small urgencies. "Can you help with the bank statement? We need to go to dinner tonight. It's important for your reputation." Her voice was always dulled toward performance. Once she spoke to Antônia in front of neighbors in a tone pitched to concern, then turned to Alexandre later and said, "You always worry too much. Your mother is fine." But the thing about patterns is that they misbehave around those who look closely. A neighbor's offhand remark, "I saw her with a pale face at the club, poor thing," combined with a delivery slip in Mariana's name and a pill bottle found in the trash, began to form a narrative that was hard to ignore. Not yet a legal narrative, but a factual one. The first blood tests took 3 days. Dr. Renato called with brief professional words. "There are anomalies. I sent a sample for a more specific screen. Toxicology requested. It may take a while." Alexandre read that as a small, cold triumph. He felt the wheels start to turn. There was comfort in bureaucracy, forms to fill, boxes to check. The lawyer advised patience. Preliminary screens sometimes showed nothing, and then later tests did. Chain of custody mattered. Samples needed to be preserved. The process was slow because it was careful. In the meantime, the household environment grew tenser. Mariana's smile condensed. She began to move with the same precise choreography, but now there was a tightness around the jaw that betrayed her. Her actions grew more small and more controlling. She began to insist Antônia rest more, then chide her for being fussy when she objected. She praised Rosangela for her loyalty, then asked for loyalty in lighter, more performative ways.
Her attention could be syrupy one moment and cold the next.
On a Thursday, towards the end of the month, an argument erupted that was more honest than any apology could have been. Alexandre had come home early, his phone buzzing a warmth in his pocket, and found Mariana going through Antonia's medicine cabinet with a level of focus that hurt. "Why are you touching her pills?" he asked. She turned with the practiced visage of surprise. "I was organizing them," she said. "They get mixed up. I only did what any responsible daughter-in-law would do." "Since when do you take care of her?" Alexandre said. "You're not her carer, you're her guest." Mariana's face tightened. "I'm trying to help this family," she snapped. "If you don't appreciate that, I can stop." "You don't help by undermining her," Alexandre said. He was angrier than he had expected. The anger surprised him because it came with the heat of ownership. This was his mother, and the idea that someone else had been orchestrating decisions about her without his consent provoked a protective fury he had never felt so strongly. She laughed, a short, unconvinced sound. "Alex, please, you know I have her best interests at heart. She's fragile. She needs structure." "Then don't give her idea of structure," he said. The argument, something like a key that finally turned. "You don't get to decide everything." Rosangela held her breath in the kitchen doorway. The confrontation could have turned ugly. Mariana's mask slipped at the edges for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, Rosangela saw the woman who had scorned small dependence. Then Mariana composed herself, as if glass had polished her face. "Look," she said softly, and folded her hands like a prayer. "This is hard for everyone. Maybe people should be more patient." The act of making the problem someone else's was a familiar gambit. But Alexandre had files now. He had notes, receipts, the sounds of his own conscience telling him that something was wrong. He did not have a conviction yet, but he had a duty to keep his mother safe until the facts could say something true. That night, Rosangela placed a fresh photo of the bruise into the folder. She tucked the small bag with the bent pill alongside it. She attached the receipt and wrote an account of the day in careful handwriting, signing and dating it. She printed a copy and handed it to Alexandre in private, as if giving him a legal instrument of a simpler age. "Keep this," she said, "for when the doctor needs to see, or the police, or whoever." "Who would do that?" Alexandre whispered, into the felt of the moment, the question both rhetorical and enraged. Rosangela nodded toward the kitchen and mouthed a name in the hush of the light. "Mariana." Her eyes were steady. "We need to be careful," she said. "If we're wrong, we will have broken something for nothing. But if we're right, we will have saved her." The idea of loving someone in secret had been part of Rosangela's life for years. She knew about the weight of proof and the cost of acting. But she also had the habit of listening to what suffering asked for: witnesses. The lawyer requested chain of custody for the samples and advised a second opinion on the results. Preliminary toxicology screens sometimes show unexpected substances that are not necessarily sinister, he told Alexandre with a tone that was both cautious and firm. That's why we need corroboration: receipts, witness statements, medication logs. The aim is to protect Antônia now, not to prove a narrative without evidence. Alexandre answered with the first clear decision of his adult life. He would be present. He canceled non-essential trips. He reallocated portions of his calendar, like a man rearranging his priorities under the light of a new compass. He moved a photograph of his mother to the center of his phone screen, like an emblem, a small reminder of why he had to change. In the days between the tests and the results, small conflicts and tendernesses threaded the house. Antônia, unaware of the procedural mechanisms assembling around her care, continued in the instinctive economy that had been her life. A kind word here, a small dish of food there. She apologized for being weak, and then pressed a hand to Alexandre's cheek as if to fix him in place. Alexandre, learning to be a defender rather than only a provider, took to sitting by her in the evenings. He listened to her stories, the ones she told like treasures. The smell of rain on the clothesline when she was a child, the way a train's whistle used to mean a father was coming home. In those stories he heard the woman who had cleaned houses, who had sewn his first school uniform, who had stood at a small altar and whispered prayers into the dark. He felt shame in the taste of feeling he had wasted time on busier things. Mariana moved through the house like a storm in a silk dress. When she sensed Alexandre was changing, her public instincts shifted. She became solicitous in public, attentive in manners, a model daughter-in-law. In private, she stretched her patience thinner and thinner. Her manipulations acquired a sharper edge. She began to speak of institutions, doctors who had opinions about age, subtle illusions about aging that painted responsibility as a burden. One night she took Antonia's hand and wept in front of her, a performance so perfectly placed it would later have critics. "You know I love you," she said, the words honey-thin. "I only ever wanted what was best." Antônia, who had practiced gratitude all her life, placed a hand on Mariana's cheeks and smiled with something gentle and tentative. She had been taught to forgive. She had also been taught not to make waves that might hurt the son she adored. Forgiveness, in her understanding, had been a way of keeping the family whole. It was only when Alexandre overheard a hurried phone call, the word switch, taut and urgent, used in a way that made no sense in benign affairs, that he felt ice. He had proven that the problem was not only being in the house, it was the things done within it. He started to keep watch more deliberately, but watchfulness is a precarious art. It requires patience and subtlety and the capacity to endure the look on a loved one's face when they say, with sleepy confusion, "I don't want to cause trouble." The second set of blood work came back with a notation that froze the room. A preliminary screen had flagged an unexpected substance. The lab did not name it in the first report. Labs often do not offer declarations without confirmatory testing. But the words were precise. Anomalous finding requiring confirmatory analysis. The phrasing was clinical and careful. It did not assign motive, it did not declare guilt. Still, it was the first piece of paper that shifted worry into the realm of official concern. Dr. Renato met with Alexandre and Rosangela in his office and explained the steps. "We will proceed with a confirmatory test and the proper chain of custody," he said. "If we find the same substance again, and especially if we can trace an external source that accounts for timing and exposure, then this becomes a matter for authorities. Until then, we must protect and document." Alexandre felt both vindicated and terrified. There was no triumph yet, only the slow, grim work of aligning fact with justice. The lawyer arranged for a secure transfer of samples and began to collect the rest of the thread. Delivery records, receipts, CCTV from a nearby building that sometimes showed a delivery person at the wrong hour. Small things began to cluster around the possibility that there had been intention. One afternoon in the law firm's small conference room, the lawyer spread photographs on the table. They were clinical photos, a bruise in close-up, a label half-peeled, a delivery slip. The lawyer's voice was calm and rendered in the chords of professional restraint. "We have corroborative items," he said. "Receipt history in Mariana's name, a delivery record showing substitution of a medication bottle on the day Antônia felt dizzy, and the preliminary toxicology flag. None of these alone is proof. Together, they form a pattern that justifies further investigation and immediate protective measures." Alexandre listened, feeling the bars of his composure tested. He thought of his mother sitting quiet in the chair at home, and of the warm hands that pressed against the ledger of her life. He thought of Rosangela, who had built a second life of testimony in the memory of a woman she had chosen to protect. What about confronting her, he asked. imagining a scene in which the wife in a silk dress would be asked to explain her actions and crumble. He wanted confrontation, like a hammer, final, unambiguous.
The lawyer's face did not harden. It simply stayed patient. Confrontation can do harm if it alerts a potential perpetrator to evidence they can destroy, he said. We proceed in a way that secures safety for Antônia first. That might mean temporary measures, restricting access to the apartment, arranging for continuous medical supervision, or having someone with her at all times. If the confirmatory test comes back consistent, then we can escalate appropriately. That night, Alexandre walked home in the rain with his head bowed. The city looked different in wet light, reflections like tiny mirrors that fractured images. He had always taken pride in his ability to solve problems. The law trains you to think in distances and precedents. But here, the measure of success felt more human. A bruise healed, a woman's sleep returned, the stop to a slow harm. At home, the house felt smaller. Antônia slept with a shawl knitted by an aunt decades ago. She worried about being a burden. Alexandre knelt by her and promised he would be here. It was a vow as old as the first time he had promised his mother he would look after her. This time, the vow carried different weight. It included administrative work and proof and boxes and a lawyer who spoke in calm tones. It included a woman at the margin named Rosangela, who had kept a ledger of kindness and now used it as evidence. Mariana watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. For a moment, exposed to it all, she seemed small. Then she set her face into something polished and moved as if to turn the scene into a tableau. "Whatever you do," she said, the words tight, "do it with care. A scandal will harm all of us." Alexandre wanted to reply with all the indignation he felt. He wanted to say that harm had already happened. But he was learning the shape of a different action: documentation, patience, legal scaffolding. He would not break the world with loud accusations before the facts were gathered. He would use the law not as a club, but as a net. In the dawn that followed these decisions, Rosangela found a small brown bottle behind a stack of unused napkins in the back of the cabinet. The bottle was not Antonia's. It bore a label that had been peeled and repositioned. Inside were tablets that did not match any prescription they had catalogued. She photographed the bottle from several angles and placed it in a sealed bag. The act felt like burying evidence and yet also like digging it up. She labeled the bag and left it for the lawyer, as if leaving a seed in the dark. The lawyer called the next morning. He wanted to meet at the house, to see things in their context. He entered as an observer with exacting eyes, the kind that see a room and note what is not. He did not ask leading questions. He listened. He looked at the bottle in the sealed bag and turned it over with gloves, not for theatrics but for protocol. "This is not a verdict," he said quietly, and Alexandre felt the line again between accusation and procedure. "But this is why chain of custody matters. I will have this analyzed. The lab will tell us if the contents align with anything in Antonia's prescribed regimen. If not, and if we find a match with the preliminary screen, then we will have a basis to seek immediate protective measures." Mariana hovered in the edges of the living room like a shadow that refused to be a person. For the first time that Alexandre could remember, she looked uncertain. The scripts she had depended on were fraying. That evening, as the sun made long the house's shadows, Antônia made tea. She accepted the cup with the careful gratitude that had been her habit. She raised it to her lips, tasted it, and paused. It was faintly metallic, yes, but also familiar. She remembered other cups that tasted the same, a flavor she had learned to ignore because it paired with the warmth of a presence. "What is it?" she asked, without knowing she was asking about everything. Alexandre watched her like someone watching someone else breathe after a scare. He said, simply, "We're finding out." Rosangela stood in the doorway, and the lawyer watched them both with an expression that admitted nothing and carried everything. The pieces were being assembled: paper, samples, photographs, witness statements. Not conclusions yet, only pressure building toward a possibility. The household, once a place of everyday exchange, reeled with the low hum of watchfulness. Someone had to name the truth. For now, they gathered the things that would let the truth be named later. When the lawyer spoke that night, his voice was a low instrument. "I will take the samples to the lab direct and request a confirmatory analysis under secure conditions," he said. "If the results come back consistent with the preliminary flag, we will have probable cause to take protective steps. We will ask the court for an emergency order if necessary to remove anyone who poses a threat to Antonia's health." Alexandre felt the words like a summons. He imagined an empty house with one chair left for himself and Antonia safe in it. He imagined going into rooms and closing doors that had once been open to a stranger's interference. He also imagined the scenes that might follow: the paper trail, the phone calls, the way evidence makes a private wound into a public record. There was pain in that translation. The family would be pulled into light. Secrets would be pried open. Yet the operative thought was simple and terrible and necessary. Better the light than the slow destruction. That night, as Antônia slept, Alexandre sat and read Rosângela's notes again. The folder had become a map. The map pointed to a possibility that had the weight of intention. He remembered the little acts of kindness his mother had shown over a lifetime. The bread she baked, the letters she kept folded, the way she taught him to tie shoelaces for a child. Anger came with the force of protection. He would not let the person who had dismantled such small mercies continue to do so. Outside, in the corridor of the building, a neighbor's steps trailed like an afterthought. Inside, the house whispered. The law is a slow instrument. It moves with documents and signatures and the sober rhythm of evidence. But it had been set in motion. Papers would move in offices, gloves would be used in labs, names would be compared. The story that had been folded into silence was beginning to unfold. Before he left the house for a meeting that he could not put off, Alexandre folded the little photograph of his mother into his wallet, a small talisman. On the way out, he paused in the hallway and looked back at the light spilling through the living room windows. Antônia sat there, hands on her lap, and smiled at nothing in particular. He saw the faint line of the bruise under fabric, and the way she pinched the edge of her cardigan like someone reminding herself of a promise. There would be no neat confrontation that night. The lawyer had told him why not. There would be papers, procedures, patience. But there would also be a choice, either to watch and stand by, or to act and risk the messiness of accusation. Alexandre had chosen the second, and as he locked the door behind him, he felt the thinness of the line between law and family draw taut. A week later, the confirmatory report was still pending. Labs move slowly when they are precise. In the interim, the lawyer advised placing temporary protections. Someone present with Antônia at all hours, limited access to the apartment, and a formal note that any alterations to her medication be logged and witnessed. The measures felt extreme to Mariana when they were suggested. Her smile fell into a smaller shape. "You don't understand how this will look," she said to Alexandre, in a voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. "If you put me out of the house, everyone will think I'm a monster." "You're not being asked to move out because we want to punish you," Alexandre said. "We're taking steps to make sure Mom is safe." She laughed then, in a short, hard sound, and walked away. The mask slid into place again, but sometimes mask edges fray. The careful machinery of protection began to hum in the apartment. A nurse came to sit during the day while Alexandre was at work. Rosângela worked mornings instead. The lawyer coordinated with the clinic to ensure tests were expedited and samples preserved under chain of custody. The measures felt extreme to Mariana when they were suggested. Her smile fell into a smaller shape. "You don't understand how this will look," she said to Alexandre, in a voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper. "If you put me out of the house, everyone will think I'm a monster." "You're not being asked to move out because we want to punish you," Alexandre said. "We're taking steps to make sure Mom is safe." She laughed then, in a short, hard sound,
and walked away. The mask slid into place again, but sometimes mask edges fray. The careful machinery of protection began to hum in the apartment. A nurse came to sit during the day while Alexandre was at work. Rosangela worked mornings instead. The lawyer coordinated with the clinic to ensure tests were expedited and samples preserved under chain of custody.
The small things that kept a household running had become instruments of evidence. Receipts tucked into magazines, a torn label, a photograph of a cup rimmed with a shimmer that caught the light like a secret. They were ordinary objects until someone looked at them as if they might talk. If this is the kind of story that matters to you, please like and subscribe. These stories reach people who might need to hear them. The measures the lawyer recommended settled on the house like a steady hand. A licensed nurse arrived in the mornings. Evenings were covered by a rotation of attendants the firm arranged through a trusted agency. A temporary order limited access to the apartment for anyone not cleared by Alexandre. It was written in clinical legal language, but in practice it meant Mariana could no longer roam the rooms with the kind of freedom that had allowed so many small cruelties to hide. They lived in a new rhythm, one of coffee drunk at the kitchen table with someone present, of pills checked and logged in a neat ledger Rosangela kept like an accountant of mercy. Alexandre sat with his mother more than he had in years. He learned to read the subtle slopes of her mood, when to make tea, when to bring blankets, when to steer the conversation away from subjects that left her flinching. There was tenderness in the boredom of caregiving too, the kind of quiet that builds trust after shock. Meanwhile, the process the lawyer had begun moved beyond the house and into offices and labs. He delivered the brown bottle, sealed in evidence, along with samples harvested under supervision. He requested expedited confirmatory analysis and chain of custody documentation that would stand up to scrutiny. The lab returned messages that were polite and slow, confirmations of receipt, notes that the procedure required careful controls, assurances that results would be communicated as soon as they were available. The lawyer did not dramatize. He was a man who preferred the steady click of procedure to the flare of confrontation. When he called Alexandre to his office to share the first authoritative page of results, his voice held the professional evenness of someone who knew how to weigh hope against proof. "There's a confirmatory result," he said. "The lab identified an anomalous compound in the sample. They found the same compound in the tablet recovered from the bottle you dropped at my office." Alexandre's throat closed around a breath. He sat with his hands folded in a way that felt training ground stoic and yet utterly human. "So it's evidence," the lawyer corrected gently. "The analysis indicates the presence of an external substance not listed in the prescribed regimen. The lab report is careful not to assign intent. It says the presence is consistent with substitution or contamination. That's for investigators to determine through corroborating items. But with chain of custody and the delivery records we've pulled, we have grounds to proceed." The lawyer spread a set of documents on his desk. There were lab printouts with technical phrases made accessible by his explanation. Anomalous compound detected. Confirmatory assay consistent with exogenous source. Sample integrity preserved. Language that read sterile on paper, but bristled with consequence in the room. He tapped a second folder. Delivery records show a package in Mariana's name on the day your mother experienced acute symptoms. CCTV from the building lobby puts someone collecting a parcel that day at the time the courier's manifest indicated pickup. There is also the bottle we found in the cabinet and the tablet we secured in evidence. Together, these items create a pattern. "What about motive?" Alexandre asked, the word tasting suddenly like a mundane thing to ask. "Motives are for later," the lawyer said. "Right now the job is to establish a factual chain. What was in the sample, where it came from, who had access to it. We'll hand this to the authorities along with witness statements. A prosecutor will decide what to do legally. Our job is to protect your mother and to make sure the facts are recorded correctly." Alexandre wanted the lawyer to be angrier, to speak in absolutes. Instead, he was methodical.
And that quality steadied Alexandra's rising panic into action. The lawyer prepared a formal presentation, lab reports, delivery records, the evidence bag, Rosangela's notes, and one more item Alexandra had not expected to be critical, a short recording. Rosangela had never planned to make a record. She had learned to keep her head down and her hands working. But when things got worse and the pills went missing again, she had done what frightened people sometimes do. She left her phone running while she interrupted a call to a woman she believed was a friend of Mariana's. The voice on the other end, hurried, practical, used a phrase that made her blood turn cold. "Remember, switch the evening tablets, nothing major, just make her sleep a little more. I'll take care of the rest," the voice advised. Rosangela had not meant to record anything. She had only meant to keep an ally's support. But the phone caught the exchange, and Rosangela had stilled her hand and kept the file. At the lawyer's office, that file became a hinge. He listened to it once, twice, then asked for a transcript. The recording's voice, distinct, calm, measured, said what the notes and receipts suggested. An instruction to alter medication timing, phrased not as cruelty, but as a strategy for managing what the speaker called fragility. When the meeting was convened to present the findings, Dr. Renato sat to one side, papers in hand, his medical demeanor informing every conversational beat. The lawyer asked everyone to be candid. He explained the evidence step by step, the confirmatory lab findings, the delivery records linking the parcel to Mariana's account, the tampered packaging, the bottle recovered in the cabinet, Rosangela's photos, and finally the recording. Mariana arrived late, immaculate in a blouse that might have been picked to suggest contrition, soft color, hands folded demurely. She had insisted on attending the meeting. Perhaps she intended to steer it, or perhaps she simply could not resist the drama she had always cultivated. The lawyer did not begin with accusation. He began with facts. He showed the lab report and read aloud the key phrase. Confirmatory assay detected an exogenous compound in the patient's specimen and in the tablet sample submitted. He explained what that meant in plain language. A substance that was not prescribed or expected had been found in both the patient's biological sample and the tablet sample recovered from the household. Dr. Renato explained the medical significance. He spoke with the careful candor of a physician who had seen too many things in between denial and diagnosis. At subclinical doses, he said, a sedative or similar substance can produce fatigue, dizziness, and fainting. Repeated low-level exposure can leave someone chronically listless, forgetful, and more vulnerable to falls. That is consistent with what we saw in Antonia's pattern. Mariana's face did not change. Her voice when she spoke was controlled. "What you've shown is circumstantial," she said, measured as if she were on a stage rehearsed to perfection. "Receiving a package in my name, I order supplements, I order vitamins, because I care for this home. Any inference beyond that is—" "Circumstantial until connected," the lawyer interrupted, calm and precise. He slid another page forward. "This is not only a delivery record, it's this." He pressed play. The recorder's audio filled the room with Rosangela's small breath, then the other voice. "Just switch the evening tablets, nothing major. She'll sleep through most of it. Don't leave traces. I'll come by later to check." The phrase, "don't leave traces," hung in the air like a glass being held under too much heat. A new kind of silence set in, the brittle sort that arrives when the world's surface has been scratched and the soft under that is revealed. Mariana's hands, which had been folded in a manner of apology, tightened. "That voice is mine," she said finally. Her voice fractured on the last syllable, the practiced edge gone. It was not a full confession. It was a fact offered in the tone of someone trying to explain a laceration away. I thought it would make things easier. I was overwhelmed." "You instructed someone to alter medication," the lawyer said simply.
You're confirmed as the account associated with the delivery. The bottle you handled was found in the cabinet, tampered with. The lab found an exogenous compound in the tablet and in the patient sample.
There is enough evidence to refer this to criminal investigation if the authorities wish to proceed. For now, the court will be asked to enforce protective measures. Mariana stood. For the first time in months, her composure slipped into something raw. I didn't want her to die, she said. Her voice was thin, fraying at the edges. She stared at Antônia as if trying to find some permission there. She was fragile. She was embarrassing at events. She made me look bad. I thought if she slept and rested, everything would be easier. I didn't think it was poisoning. That last word landed with an odd placement between denial and admission. It was not legal confession so much as the unraveling of someone's inner arithmetic. Alexandre felt anger rise and then checked it against the room. They had to protect his mother now. What you did was dangerous, Dr. Renato said, his tone neither theatrical nor cruel, merely clear. You altered medication without consent. You exposed a vulnerable person to risk. Whether your intent was to harm or to control is for investigators. Right now, we document and prevent further exposure. Mariana's shoulders sagged, and for the first time she looked like a woman who had been performing a role and now realized the role had consequences she had not fully rehearsed for. Her eyes filled. No melodrama swept through the room. It was a human thing, private, messy. The lawyer called a meeting with the building's concierge and the courier company that had delivered the parcel. They obtained CCTV footage that corroborated the time the parcel was collected and a signature electronically tied to an account. The courier explained that the order had been placed online under Mariana's profile, delivered to the building's mailroom at an odd hour. The courier's records, when matched to the delivery manifest, placed a hand on the parcel that day, the same day Antonia's faintness had escalated. The police liaison arrived the following morning, polite and precise. They had the lab report, the sworn statements, the recording, and the physical evidence. They accepted the documentation and assured them the matter would be reviewed. They advised the immediate step of protective custody for the patient's medication and recommended a formal complaint if Alexandre decided to press charges. The decision lived in Alexandre's hands as much as the papers did. For Mariana, the unveiling was a collapse of the life she had managed to script. The social circle that had once admired her carefully chosen words and crisp hosting began to retreat. Neighbors who had been willing to laugh with her at a brunch now sidestepped, unsure. On social media, she posted a brief, composed note about misunderstandings and stress, but its reach felt thinner than the noise it intended to quiet. The more immediate consequences were practical. A judge, presented with the evidence and a motion for protective measures, granted temporary directives. Immediate restriction of Mariana's access to the apartment. Supervised visits in a controlled setting if requested, and an order that any medications be administered only by licensed personnel. The order did not convict anyone. It did, however, prioritize Antonia's safety. On the day the order was delivered, Mariana packed a small bag and left the apartment under escort, saying little. She did not resist, nor did she attempt to lash out. There was a look in her eyes that resembled the way someone looks at a life that has sharpened into consequences. She left with her dignity intact in public, but fragile in private. The house, for the first time in many months, exhaled. The aftermath was a slow, careful tending. Antonia's energy returned in small increments, the way a river finds its channel. First a glance, then a story, then longer walks to the window. Medicine was administered with strict logs. Dr. Renato checked in daily, documenting recovery and ensuring there were no lingering effects. Rosangela continued to be a quiet pillar, her hands steady as ever, her ledger of kindness now an official record. Alexandre found that the protective measures pulled at more than the household's rhythms. They pulled at him. He had to wrestle with guilt and relief,
with the public exposure of a private wound, with the way the legal process had made his family's grief a matter for strangers in uniforms and men in offices. But there was also a relief that lived behind the paperwork. His mother's smile again in the morning, a book in her lap, a story told without the tremor that had become a punctuation in her speech. There were conversations that needed to be had. Alexandre visited Mariana once in a neutral space arranged by the lawyer, not as vengeance, but because he needed answers, and perhaps because he needed closure. The conversation was raw and spare. "Why?" he asked. "I told you," she said. "I was trying to manage. I thought if she rested, things would be easier. I had obligations, expectations. I couldn't stand the way she embarrassed me. I told myself I was being practical." "You hid it," Alexandre said. "You lied to us. You compromised her life." She swallowed. "I thought I could control it. I didn't plan murder. I thought I would just—" Her voice frayed. "I thought she'd sleep more. I thought we'd all be happier." "That's not yours to decide," he said. The sentence was simple. It held a world in its smallness. She sat for a long moment before replying. I know now." There was no absolution there, only the recognition of what had been done. In the quiet that followed, neither of them found answers more satisfying than the concrete measures that had been taken to protect Antônia. Months passed.
The criminal side of the case moved at its own pace through police investigation and, if a prosecutor chose to proceed, court filings and hearings. Alexandre could not predict the legal outcome. He could only keep his mother safe, tend to her healing, and witness to the fact that sometimes love looks like paperwork and persistence. Slowly, Antônia reclaimed small freedoms. She resumed tea with a friend who lived 2 floors below and began attending a small religious group that gathered once a week at the local chapel. She kept her ritual of knocking on the table, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, and the rhythm had become a beat of resilience rather than one of mere habit. Rosangela received recognition in a quieter currency, the gratitude of a family whose silence she had pierced. Alexandre found himself saying the word "thank you" with an ache that felt like prayer. The lawyer, who had insisted on procedure over theater, refused the kind of effusive praise Alexandre at times attempted. He accepted a formal note and an invitation to dinner after several months, an evening where he sat at the end of the table and listened while the household spoke of simpler things. The scandal became a lesson in the neighborhood. People began to notice the little things they had not seen before, the way an elderly neighbor's mail piled up, the way a caregiver flinched when asked a question, the way a daughter-in-law's perfection could hide cruelty. A few people called the helpline the lawyer recommended. Others rearranged their visits to friends' houses. The story spread not as sensational gossip, but as a caution. Look, listen, and act. When the day came that Alexandre finally felt able to invite his mother to his own small apartment for dinner, he hesitated at the threshold. The past months had changed him. He had rearranged his priorities and learned how grief and legal procedure sometimes live in the same sentence. He took his mother's hand and led her inside. She placed her small clutch on the table and looked around with the careful curiosity of someone reacquainting herself with a life that had been put on hold. She smiled at Alexandre, and then at the photograph of herself and him on his phone cover, a small proof that some things endure. "Thank you," she whispered later that night, when the room had settled and the dishes were done, "for not letting me be invisible." Alexandre took her hand. "I should have been here sooner," he said. The sentence was true and necessary. It also contained the quiet work of repair. There are no neat endings to what they had been through. Legal processes can continue in filings and hearings. The emotional work of repair is ongoing and requires patience. But there was also a truth that had been sharpened. The vigilant acts of a housekeeper, the steady work of a physician, and the methodical labor of a lawyer had combined to expose a pattern that might otherwise have stayed hidden. In the months after the exposure, Mariana's life changed. Some doors that had been open to her closed, others shifted to a new shape. She entered counseling and was monitored for compliance with the court's orders. She did not avoid consequences, and she did not escape the fact of what she had done. The exposure had not been about punishment alone. It had been about stopping harm and creating the possibility of understanding why it had happened and preventing its repetition. At the heart of the story was Antonia's recovery, not only of bodily strength, but of voice. She learned to speak without apologizing for being ill or for needing help. She let someone else make the tea for her sometimes. She took walks in the mornings with Rosangela. She returned to the chapel and, in a small voice one Sunday after Mass, thanked the people who had come to sit with her when she was afraid. Those moments of gratitude were modest and human, and the truest kind. The lawyer's role remained professional. His confession, as the title would later be styled in breathless retellings, had not been a moral revelation, but a public explanation of the evidence assembled. He had explained the findings, the lab results, and the chain of events that allowed them to ask for protection. He had been the instrument through which private worry became formal record. In doing so, he had given a family the chance to close the door on a period of harm. Alexandre never stopped wondering why he had delayed. He had not been a bad son. He had been a busy one. He learned to live with a humility that came from the sense of having a duty neglected and then fulfilled. He spoke publicly once at a neighborhood group about the importance of listening to caregivers, of taking notes, of preserving evidence. He told the room how Rosangela's small acts had saved a life, how a doctor's concern had opened a door, and how the law, slow but deliberate, had given them a path to safety. If there is one thing they would ask of anyone who listens, it is this: watch the small things. Notice the odd habits and document them. Photograph a bruise. Note the times someone looks faint. Keep a receipt if it seems odd. Small records become the bones on which truth rests. In the quiet that followed, Alexandre sat with his mother on the balcony and watched the city at dusk. The air smelled of bread and cut grass. She reached up and laid a hand on his cheek, the gesture of a lifetime packed into a moment. "You did well," she said, the words simple and enough. He leaned his forehead to hers. "We did it together," he answered. They had asked a lawyer to look, to gather, to present. He had confessed only in the sense that he revealed what the evidence disclosed. But it was not the lawyer's words alone that saved them. It was the courage of a housekeeper who would not stay silent, of a doctor who documented what he saw, of a son who chose to rearrange his life, and of a system that, when set in motion with care, could bend toward protection. The house was quieter now in ways that were gentle, not fearful. The traces of what had happened remained in the careful logs, the lined pages in Rosangela's folder, and the recorded testimony that had finally given voice to long-muted pain. They kept those things not as trophies, but as guarding instruments, proof that someone had listened. In time, the household rebuilt itself on a foundation that included vigilance and tenderness. Antônia stopped avoiding her son's home in the way she had once felt she must. She visited when she wanted, not out of obligation. There were apologies that could not erase weeks of fear, and there were acts of caretaking that rebuilt trust molecule by molecule. The story was never about sensational headlines. It was about the small, stubborn work of noticing, documenting, and protecting the vulnerable. For Alexandre, the lesson was indelible. Love sometimes demands paperwork, presence, and the courage to let the law do its steady work. For Rosangela, it was an affirmation that bearing witness could save a life. For Antônia, it was the quiet reclaiming of mornings, of tea savored, of a life no longer siphoned by shadow. If this story moved you, please share it and tell us in the comments if you've ever noticed signs that someone you love needed help. Your attention could make the difference between silence and safety.